we go. So we're going to talk about different ways of moving from bright ideas to relationships that will help community-led homes projects move forward. And we've got Andy Lloyd here, who I think most of you know, and no doubt he'll introduce himself properly when I give him the chance. But I thought it might just be really useful. I know we're a small group, but if we could all just introduce ourselves, and then we'll all know who we are, because I think there might be one or two gaps in that. So Lorraine, can I just pass to you first?
Hello everybody, I'm Lorraine. I'm the Chief Executive Act, and I try and help Fran with the housing brief. So knowing some stuff seems like a good idea. Thank you.
Fiona, you're next on my screen.
I'm Fiona, and with Becky.
Oh, can't hear you, Fiona, sorry. You sounded a bit distant. So I think we could try again.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, that's better. Yes.
I'm Fiona, and along with Becky, we're part of a new community land trust for Kendal. So we're looking to find a site and develop a preferably 100% affordable passive house scheme similar to the Halton one. We have only just started with that.
No, great, you can join us. Thank you very much indeed. Look forward to seeing where your thoughts fit with this conversation this evening. Damien, you're next on my screen.
I'm Damien Morris, West Cumbria officer for ACT. I'm working with a group in Milham who are looking to develop or refurbish empty homes in Milham. So I've joined tonight to learn a lot more stuff and pick people's brains. Thank you.
Thank you, Damien. Becky.
Hi, Becky Winter. As Fiona says, I work with her at Lancaster City Council, and we are starting Kendal CLT.
Brilliant, great stuff. And Lucy.
Hello, my name's Lucy. I was setting up an Appleby Community Land Trust, but due to lack of interest, I'm talking to possibly the Bay Area Self-Build group. And so, yes, I'm here. That's as far as I've got with the community-led housing.
That's great. That's great. We'll just try and fill in any gaps in your thought process that we can, and hopefully you can take away some ideas and options to talk to people about. Thank you for joining us, Lucy. Okay, so that's helpful. As I say, we are a small but perfectly formed group this evening, and hopefully we'll be able to target some of the information that we've got so that it's of most use to you directly. I just have a few things to say before I hand over to Andy, and mostly I have to be completely candid and say that I would really like it if community groups could just get on and do this themselves very easily and achieve the dreams that they have unfettered. that would be my object for community-led housing groups. The sad reality is that it's very complicated and difficult, and despite the work of lots of very clever people, it remains quite a challenging thing for a community group to take on. And there are a number of points in the journey that the movement has gone through, which have points at which people have made great strides and completed wonderful projects and done it in ways which we've looked at with envy and admiration and really wanted to reproduce. But we find that situation has changed and the funding landscape has changed, and that something in housing, the way affordable homes policies are written, has changed. So things move around us in such a way as it doesn't make it easier at the moment. And actually, quite a lot of the groups that I know Andy will have worked with in the past, and groups that I've been in contact with in the more recent years, have just find it so difficult that they might give up. And part of the reason for the creation of the hubs is to try and try and minimize that, just keep groups trickling along until they find the solution that's right for them. But what the reality is at the moment is that unless you're very clear about the hurdles you'll have to get through, and you know that you've got the skills and the staying power to do that yourselves, the very best way at the moment of pursuing community-led homes is to work closely with a partner who's got lots more experience than your community group. It's not the only way, but it's the fact is at the moment that in order to access Homes England funding, you either have to be working or be working with. It's not me.
I'm sorry, I'm trying to.
Oh, it's you, Lucy. You either have to be or be working with a registered provider for social housing in order to access Homes England funding. I may have oversimplified that, and Andy will no doubt explain in more detail what we're alluding to here. But really, what I think Andy's presenting tonight is a pragmatic set of options, which are a very realistic set of ways forward, which are tried and tested now. So always worth exploring other people's experience, and then trying to see how it fits with your own plans and thoughts. And we can, we've got enough time this evening to hear what Andy's got to say and to ask questions very specifically about the situations we're all in, and try and work out whether there are conversations that we can help with going forward. So I think that's all I wanted to say at this stage. If I hand over to Andy, you should be able to do screen share from your computer, Andy. Let's see if that's going to work.
Yep. So, what are you seeing at the moment?
We're still seeing ourselves at the moment.
Right. I've clicked on screen share. So you've disabled me from screen sharing just at the moment.
No, I don't think so. Shall I do it? Shall I put your slides up and then you can just next slide me?
Okay.
Sorry.
That's great. Thanks very much, Fran.
Okay. Apologies.
Hi, Lucy. Hi, everybody. Yeah, so in the beginning, as they say, the intention was that CLTs would be an alternative to housing association provision, and I think it really was catalysed by the right to buy and seeing council houses being sold off and so on, and looking at the American CLT model, which protected homes over the long term. So it was kind of like going back to basics. I think we might have missed the first slide there, Fran. I'm not sure. Yeah, we did. So yeah, we all expected to be able to kind of evolve a parallel system, parallel universe, but it didn't turn out to be possible in the long run, really, because in order to get the essential subsidy, in order to make housing affordable, we had to apply to the various different versions of Homes England that have existed over the years, and conditions crept in, like having to be a registered provider and so on. So there's the bureaucracy side of it, which is something to take into account, but also the issue of the workload, really, and the risk involved. But if we move on, nonetheless, the first few projects which I was involved with in Cumbria, they were independent schemes that in each case, there's this slide and the following slide, we set out to identify a housing association to provide project management, but the community was going to actually own the houses. And at that point in time, we couldn't find housing associations to provide project management. So each community, each of these two schemes actually kind of slipped into the realization that they were going to have to do it themselves. But we did get bits of help from housing associations, which made the process easier in some ways. And if we move on to the next slide as well. So both Livenet and Keswick Community Housing Trust developed very successful projects, but it was a huge amount of work for the volunteers involved. And they've now become significant players in each of their communities, so that they've actually made a big difference to people who were looking for housing in those communities. So this is all about looking at if you didn't want to take on all of that workload and responsibility, what are the options? Thanks, Fran. So from the community point of view, we're wondering, is there a way in which we could go into a partnership with a housing association or perhaps a developer, so that we can still achieve the aims, but to do that in a realistic way, looking at the capacity of the people who are involved. So there will always be groups of people who are not fazed by the idea of taking on responsibility for something, perhaps because of their professional careers, the fact that they've got they're confident in their ability to learn about a new subject, and they've got the time available. But it is a big, complex thing to try and take on housing development. So it's all about pitching the responsibility at the right level for your group and making sure that the workload and the risk is appropriate. And there are ways of doing this. One of the big factors is also whether or not people have got the appetite to become a registered provider, which is quite a big bureaucratic process to go through. It's obviously doable because both Keswick and Crosby Ravensworth became registered providers, but it's just a question of exploring these issues with new groups to find out what's right for them. And the last point there is it works two ways in terms of sites, because sometimes communities bring sites to housing associations and sometimes it's the other way around. Or it could be that the housing association could help to actually analyse the site and determine whether or not it's actually appropriate for development. Thanks, Fran. So from the housing association point of view, I've missed off by accident the point about sites, because communities do bring land to housing associations. If there's a partnership arrangement, very often the community's already got a site lined up. So that was the case in Halton for the Loon Valley Community Land Trust. But in any case, housing associations will vary in whether they want to get involved in these sorts of arrangements. Sometimes they just haven't got the spare capacity themselves to realistically devote to working with a community or for a community. So timing is an issue. But a lot of housing associations are open-minded about new ways of working and interested in the possibility of actually working in a partnership with a community in a more pragmatic way, rather than just delivering the homes and moving people in. So from the housing association point of view, there can be a huge advantage to having a community that actually is actively wanting to work with you, as actually working through the communication issues within its own households, so that people, the level of communication between the community land trust and its community is likely to be really quite high. So people's concerns have been worked through very often, and the community can, I mean, depending on what's available at the time, because it's always coming and going, but there is very often specialist funding, which even if a housing association is developing on behalf of a community, the community or its partner can access that specialist funding, and that can very often reduce costs for the housing association. So that's something which is something that they're interested in. And then, depending on what the type of partnership is, and just to say that there's a new guide just being produced by community-led homes. It's on their website, and I'll dig out the link for that after we finish this evening and send it through to Fran. Well, Fran's probably already got it. And that actually details a whole range of different types of partnerships. So this evening we're just looking at a couple of examples, really. Two examples of partnerships with housing associations and an example of working with a developer. But depending on what the model is, the housing association can earn fee income and potentially long-term rental income from these schemes. So it's helping them to actually do something which they're doing anyway, but with the following wind of the community. Thanks, Fran. So the first specific model to look at is the one which Becky and I have been involved in Halton, which is described as a development lease. And this is where the community, through one route or another, perhaps by grant or perhaps if the council makes an asset transfer, the community comes into the ownership of a piece of land. It could already perhaps be in the ownership of the community. And it's then able to lease that piece of land to the housing association. And in that case, rather than taking on the whole weight of the development process, the community's main focus is actually negotiating the terms of that relationship through the lease with legal help. And so they can secure the outcomes which they're looking for, which, you know, when you distill it down, we're looking at local priority, local affordability, and homes which are protected in perpetuity. And there may be more, there may be involvement in design, and there should also be some oversight into the effectiveness of the management of the project in the long term. But essentially, the community would focus on describing what its aims are, selecting a housing association partner, and then negotiating the outcomes that it's seeking through the terms of the lease. So there's a lot less responsibility and work and risk involved in this as a model. And obviously, because the housing association is actually taking on the responsibility for delivery of the project, then both sides are going to have to talk to each other, and there's going to be inevitable compromises in terms of what's possible, what the community may be looking for particular space standards, and there may be a need to compromise a little bit on those sorts of things. So that'll come out in the negotiations. And the other thing about this this particular model is because the housing association, if there are rented homes involved, which require capital grant from Homes England, and that's usually the case, then whoever owns and manages the rented homes needs to be a registered provider. So this is registering with the regulator of social housing, and it's a process which requires quite a lot of time and effort. So this model means that the existing housing association fulfills that role, and therefore the community group doesn't need to worry about that as another hoop to jump through. So it's a very simple, relatively speaking, simple process for any community group that's looking to provide affordable rented houses for its community. So that's the development lease model, and we can, if we go to the next slide, there's a few examples. Thanks. So in the southwest of England, Steve Watson, who's the second from the right on that picture at the bottom there, with Wessex CLT, which is one of these enabling hubs like Cumbria, they've done a huge number of development lease schemes. They tend to specialise in just doing development leases, but they've done it very well and delivered a large number of projects, and worked with a lot of local authorities and housing associations. So there's some good partnership working there. In Cumbria, this first has been pioneered by actually with the parish council, I think, in Langdale, which involved one of the staff members of ACT itself. And they managed to actually go into partnership with Castleton Coast and the delivery of 4 rented homes, which I think went quite well as far as I've heard. So that was a light touch development for the community, and similar kind of approach has been decided by the Loon Valley Community Land Trust, where in the early stages we looked at all the different options, and because the board members of the CLT largely came from the very successful co-housing project at Lancaster Forge Bank in Halton, where members of the group actually self-delivered 41 houses and community facilities. So they're very capable of doing development, but they just didn't really want to take on the workload. And so they opted to go down the road of the development lease, and they went through a selection process, and now sometime down the road they've actually got a fantastic working partnership with South Lakes Housing Association, and they've just recently got the planning permission, so they've been progressing things despite the virus situation and so on. And it's a very well thought through scheme on a piece of land close to the existing co-housing scheme, and it's also linked to a scheme the same size right next door, so they're sharing a site, which is going to be a second co-housing scheme for older people. Thanks, Fran. By the way, just shout out if you've got questions or anything. We don't have to wait till the end, so we can have conversation. So the second model with housing associations is the consortium model, and this requires more altruism on behalf of the housing association, because the role that they're providing here is to actually take on the job of development. So to actually get all the houses built and then hand them over to a partner organisation like a community land trust. And so in one sense, it requires a housing association which is very focused on its social mission and doesn't see this as being unrealistic or too much effort and so on. And there are housing associations who have done this up and down the country. So it is a real option, but of course it does depend on a housing association being interested and willing and so on. And so because the scheme is going to end up in the hands of the community group, this saves you all the risk and the effort of development, but you still, if you've got rented houses involved, you still need to become a registered provider. But that is more manageable because you haven't been weighed down with the responsibility of development. So it's just one thing to think about, really. And then when the project is handed over, the community group, because they're a registered provider, they've got the option of either getting stuck into housing management themselves, which is what Keswick have done, although I think they've now got a part-time officer because they've got a certain critical mass of rental income. But they could also contract that job out an existing housing association, and that's what Crosby Ravensworth did. So that's the consortium model. Thanks, Fran. And then this is an example of a consortium development. So it's done for a community group by a housing association, but it's not quite as I just described on the previous slide. So it went through a few phases. It had its ups and downs. I've spent some time corresponding with the group here, and it's a very interesting story. But now everything's built and everybody's living in place, and it's all working very well. But this is also kind of typical of the way that things tend to work. You can have a model which is an archetype, but it may vary when you actually sit down with your partner organization. It may be that it will work out slightly differently for various different reasons. And this started a long time really before these sorts of partnership models have become well established. Thanks, Fran.
On that one, Andy, can I ask a question? How come they weren't required to be a registered provider then, the managing organisation, the co-op lot? Why did they not?
Well, it was an interesting one because if I understand correctly, they were a community client group who commissioned the A project, and Hanover Housing Association, the chief executive at the time, was quite keen to help. So they did the initial development, but the scheme was then transferred to Homes for Women Housing Association in London. So they're the registered provider that owns the project, but the group, the community group, were the original clients. So it was all designed and built to their specification. So it's an example of something, which it's a consortium model, but it's a little bit different. And this one doesn't involve any affordable housing, but it's community-led housing. It's co-housing, which is a fantastic way of living together and providing a sense of community and support and shared resources and so on. And in this instance, the council made a site available to a group that had formed as a co-housing group. So they're all private individuals who had the spending power to be able to pay for their own homes. There was no bureaucracy involved in having to become a registered provider or apply for grant from government and so on. But what their approach to procurement is really interesting, because what they did was they wisely decided not to self-develop, but they found a relatively small developer called Town, who was a newish developer who was a couple of guys who had set out to do much more ecologically sound housing than they were looking at, in terms of they wanted to try and set a new standard, new precedent. And they actually sort of helped to shape up a realistic scheme, something which was going to be buildable. So they were worked closely with the group to deliver what they wanted, but also to make sure that it was going to work, both financially as well as design. And they then brought in this company from Sweden, Trivselhus, which is apparently it's a workers' cooperative. And they have got the problem because they've got lots of cash slurping around. They've got a huge amount of cash because they've been so successful over the years. And they basically were very laid back about banking the whole scheme. So they cash flowed it, and then when everything was finished, both town and Tripsell, who's the group, each household bought their individual houses, which paid town and Tripsell House. So it's a very interesting way of procuring a scheme. Thanks, Fran. So if you were going to go into partnership, then it's worth thinking about how you would do that. And you may find yourselves talking to an organisation and it looks like it's going to be great just working with them. And so you may not need to go further. But very often groups are not in touch with developers or housing associations. And really the best thing that the group can do is to try to sort of do its homework first, so that there needs to be a process of distilling what the aims and objectives are, and then presenting those in a really effective way. So the idea of designing a prospectus, which is it doesn't have to be fancy in the way that it's, in terms of graphic design, but it's the content that really matters. So you need to actually think through your vision, what you're setting out to deliver. And you need to have a think about what your, if you like, your red lines are. What are the absolutely key characteristics of the project you're putting forwards, which you really wouldn't be very happy if you had to compromise on them, because they're, if it's a CLT, for instance, it could be the perpetuity aspect and local allocations and so on. And then put that in a prospectus and provide some context, so that, if the people that you're talking to haven't heard of community-led housing, or have heard of it but are not very familiar with it, you're providing them with some reassurance that this has been done lots of times before. It's been thought through, and there's lots of interesting examples and people who you can go and talk to and so on. And that you're a group that's got support, hopefully, so that you've got somebody who's guiding you through the process, whichever process it is that you've chosen to go through. And then you can circulate that, for instance, to housing associations, and hopefully get some responses, and then perhaps have informal discussions, maybe have an interview or more than one interview, and see what comes out of that, which is what Loon Valley Community Land Trust did, and that's how they got in touch with South Lakes Housing.
Andy, can I ask then, for the CLH at this stage, what tends to be the more favourable legal structure? How are they organised? Are they like limited company, a CIC? What at this stage? What tend your experience?
Well, in the early days, everybody incorporated as charities because it was the main one that people knew about, and it had instant recognition, so people were confident in the branding. But as we've sort of grappled with different housing projects and so on, sometimes the Charity Commission can be slow, or can be, it can be awkward trying to match what you're trying to do with charitable objects, which they can seem a little bit feudal sometimes, relief of poverty. It will work, and sometimes you have to set up a charity because you may need, for instance, it might smooth the path, as it did in Keswick, with a piece of land owned by the diocese, so dealing charity to charity. But more recently, a lot of people have got, what we tend to do is we tend to say to groups, let's distill what you're about, and then give that to a solicitor and say, okay, we think that such and such might be the right type of company. Is that correct, or do you have another view? And out of that process, a lot of people have been turning to the Community Benefit Society model. And then the interesting thing about that is that you can also register that as a charity, an exempt charity. So it's like having your cake and eating it, and it's also able to do things like share issues, which Keswick did. CICs, people are a bit skeptical about CICs because we think that they can the regulation is not really very hands-on, and they can be used like private businesses almost. So you know, these are things worth keeping an eye on. So there we go. That's kind of how you might go through the process of selecting a partner, and really just to say, you know, I think the other thing about partnerships is you can go it alone, and you know, it's great to be able to do that. But I think also in terms of making these sorts of things doable for any community where it's not necessarily a very experienced, empowered group of people who have got the skills, you know, they might be engineers or solicitors or architects or whatever. You know, this is relevant to any community, and the more that we can actually make it an easy process, then more communities will be able to consider this as an option. And in fact, when you look at countries like Germany, that is the case. Communities aren't really doing this kind of thing on their own. It's councils, local authorities who are actually providing all the facilitation and support, and the council is actually doing all the land assembly, and they tend to invite people into the process when they've already got the land sorted out. Whereas here, one of the first jobs you tend to get is, okay, that sounds great, go and find a piece of land, you know, which is not easy. So you know, I think the German model I sort of tend to go on about, that it does, you know, if we can get to that sort of a point where we've got a system which almost anybody could plug into, then I think that's where it starts to get exciting, really.
Sorry, Andy, can I chip in with a question? I put it in the chat, but the selection process, do you have to do a selection process for picking an RP, or could you potentially just know who you wanted in the first place and just go with them?
Yeah, I think you could. I think it's a bit like selecting an architect, for instance, because you might have a really nice relationship with an architect, but even so, you know, either of those situations, it's great that you've got that, but you do need to sort of run a few checks just to make sure, for instance, that you know, if it was an architect, you'd want to know that their fees were going to be competitive, you know, because they might be a great architect that you get on with really well and have good ideas, but if they're going to charge too much, it's not really the right way to go. You know, so with a housing association, obviously, if you've already got an active and actively interested housing association, then you want to sound them out. But there may be things that you'd want to just sort of double check, and that really should come out in the initially, you know, through informal discussions. But at some point, you'd have a lawyer who was helping you, saying, well, you need to think about such and such, and then, you know, there's this. Well,
okay, that's great. That really helpful run through there, Andy, and obviously some questions have already arisen, and that's brilliant. I just had a couple of things I wanted to pick up on that, you know, just to bring forward from what you've said. I think the idea of a prospectus is really helpful, actually, and it helps people to frame their thoughts and conversations quite well, and makes people really clear about what you described as the red lines. And I think that's really good, because you could write your prospectus at a number of different points in your thought process, but still know that your red lines were there, and that if you were looking for a site, for instance, you didn't have a site that was clear, you could still be very clear about what your aim was, and have a clear and useful conversation with potential partners about what you're trying to achieve. I think that's a really useful idea for us to take forward. I thought it was interesting that both of the examples of consortium model you shared didn't quite fit the model you described, but that's fair enough, and I think that's absolutely the nature of the beast. Can I just ask, I'm sorry, I'm just going to indulge myself as take chair's prerogative and ask a question about registration as a registered provider, if you were going through that consortium process and you were the community only doing this once, presumably you have to use that scheme as your registration model. And therefore, at what point do you do it? What's the practicality there for being the registered provider? Do you help groups with their registration at the moment? I know you've done it in the past. Is that part of what you do?
I led on the registration for Keswick, but that was quite some time ago, and the process was a lot gentler in those days. But since I've been working with Leeds Community Homes, my job share colleague and myself have actually looked into this and written up some guidance for groups and so on, so that we understand the process. But and we could go through it with a group, but I personally haven't done that with the modern process. But you don't have to actually complete your registration until the homes are ready to occupy, ready to let. But the thing about the process is that if you look at the guidance, they advise you not to start even with the sort of preliminary application unless you're at the right point. And the two things that they're really looking at, one is really sound governance, because a lot of people think that they've set up a company and they've got a board and so on, and that's enough. There's more to it than that in terms of policies and procedures. And the other is that you've got a live scheme. In the past, people could say we intend to develop and so on, and there was a high dropout rate, whereas now you have to have a live scheme which is pretty much ready to go. It doesn't have to be at the start on site point, but you need to be able to show that you've got properly worked through viability costings and indicative offers of funding and finance and so on, so that it's worth the trouble of registering, if you like. So, but you'd be working with the housing association if it's a consortium. That they would be actually doing the number crunching and so on, making sure that all of that was okay.
Okay, that's helpful. I think that confirms to me that what we're talking about there is a pretty much contractual relationship with the the original housing association, to get the group to a certain point and then set them free, as it were. It's very, very, as you said, it's much more about the housing association wanting to help. But I imagine that there's some money involved in buying their time and expertise, and that would seem only fair if then what you're going to do is set up as a registered provider doing exactly the job they would have done, but slightly differently, possibly. So yes.
Well, of course, we're never going to meet the housing need that's out there. So having an extra registered provider is not a bad thing. But it does depend on catching the right. It's all about people and workloads, and if you catch people at the right time, it's definitely an option. So you can only talk to people about it and see whether it's got legs.
Could I ask Andy, is there about maybe 9 or 10 Cumbrian-based associations, obviously, who have big parent associations, Riverside, etc., etc. How many of those have done that sort of model where they've sort of, in your slides you named 1 or 2, South Lakes District Council, who's obviously not a housing association, but
so we've got Eden Housing Association. I should have mentioned actually. They're doing they're in the early stages of doing a development lease with Patterdale Parish Council, right. And they've been interested for some time. They've offered to help different projects, but this is the first one that's coming together. And they actually are the housing association that's managing the stock for the Live Bennett Community Trust. But I think it's one of those things which it's a slow burn. You know, when Live Ennis and Keswick were just starting out, housing associations were busy doing their own thing. They hadn't really heard about community-led housing. They were kind of interested, and they did give lots of help in different ways, but it didn't translate into partnerships. Whereas now, I think, you know, not only do we have known ways of doing things, but we've got local housing associations who have done this, and I think castles and coasts are potentially interested in doing more. You know, so there's a few there now.
When I used to work in housing, so two housing associations I worked there a few years ago, they closed their development departments. I saw a lot of housing associations decimated their development departments and reduced all sort of developments that they were planning or scaled it down. And then I think Homes England, there was a big push for smaller housing associations, etc., to merge. You know, this whole thing about merging, big is beautiful, and risk, and looking at risk and mitigating risk on self-assessment and stuff. Well, so there's a big change for them, I think.
It's a good point, because that's one of the things that needs to be in the back of your mind, because you might say that smaller housing associations might make good partners for you know, small community projects, because communications might be better and so on. But of course, smaller housing associations might, from time to time, they might merge. You know, so what's going on in a housing association, you can't predict what's going to happen in the future. So with all of this, you know, the general intention is going to work, but there will be occasions when difficulties crop up or things change and so on.
Lorraine, I can see you've posted some things in the chat, so thank you very much for putting those documents up. That's really helpful. Chip in.
I'm just wondering, Andy or Fran, what you would say about almshouses as a model, because they're considered quite old-fashioned, but I'm quite interested in them as a partnership model, because I think they're trying to kind of renovate and be a bit more modern in their approach.
Fran?
Well, from my point of view, I've had some really encouraging conversations with people from both from local almshouse groups and from the Almshouse Association themselves. They are traditionally associated with provision of retired workforces. So they tend to be small properties that are aimed at older people retiring and who have been on low incomes, so don't have lots of money in the bank. But that is the older interpretation, and I think that they are very interested in the flexibility that their model creates for other sorts of beneficiary groups. What I'm not clear about, Lorraine, is the point at which the registered provider issue arises, and how, if you set yourself up as an almshouse, whether you still need to be registered as a provider if that's what you're doing. If you're letting socially affordable property, then I assume you still have to be a registered provider. We were told at one point that that was definitely not the case, but I have a feeling that was actually not true. And I haven't yet spoken to an almshouse who isn't either a registered provider or working very closely with one. So the same issues arise as would for any other community group, but it's an interesting model. The Almshouse Association are very keen to support groups who are looking at delivering that, you know, a housing that would fit their understanding. Very charitably focused, very much focused on the needs of the beneficiaries, and with a terrific track record over several hundred years. So, you know, that they've got a lot going for them. Yeah. And did you have any experience?
My first thought is I'd better put my name down for an almshouse house then. That's who they're catering for. Yeah, well, they're an existing organisation, and therefore an existing organisation can kind of get involved in development, housing development. It can expand its operations to start doing new development if it wants to, but it doesn't always suit an organisation. So I can understand that almshouses might want to. It might be much better for them to work in partnership with an existing registered provider, because there's also some arcane stuff around asset locks, and if you're going to become a registered provider, that provides an asset lock, and if you've got an existing statutory asset lock, you might have to reincorporate in order to become a registered provider. So I'm sure that they're probably familiar with all of that if they've decided to get involved in housing. That would be either why they are becoming registered providers or why they're working in partnership. But yeah, so that you need a bit of corroboration on that.
I suspect they become registered housing providers so they can access public money, because it's the only way to access public money.
Certainly, that's the only reason why you would become a registered provider.
Yes, quite. Yeah. Okay, I'm conscious that of all of the models that you've mentioned, the development lease scheme seems the most likely to fit in Kendal, and possibly the Millham conversation, although I don't know whether we're quite there yet. I don't know whether we know that much. Becky and Fiona, I just wonder if there are any things you want to explore about your situation that Andy might specifically be able to address with regard to your relationship with a potential housing partner. And I know it's early days, but we're here to sort of just explore the issues and see what's going on in your thoughts. So just seeing if you've got any questions.
Well, it was where I was asking, do we need to look elsewhere? Because what Halton have found already in South Lakes housing, I'd find it hard to think we'd find better. What they're achieving with that partnership is what we would hopefully aspire to. They're going passive house, they're exceeding space standards. You know, they've got the community element to it, with some shared spaces, cars on the outside, and of course it's mixed tenure affordable housing. So and it's been smooth. They've been really working really well together. So I'm thinking, do we have to bother looking elsewhere? But it is a community project, and you don't want the community at any point to ever think like decisions are made already. So yeah, that's my own thought about it. Really, is not to go in it with thinking we already know what we're doing, but to try and keep it open and fair. And
But it's better that way around than the early days when it was really quite difficult to get the attention of housing associations. You know, it's a great situation to be in.
But if we've got South Lakes in mind, South Lakes Housing Association, do we then approach, when we're at the point when we're ready to do this, do we approach other housing associations and say, this is the model that South Lakes Housing can do? What do you think? Can you do better? Or do we go there with a bit more of a neutral playing field and say, this is what we're looking for, what can you give us?
I think you need to grow your steering group and explore opinions within the steering group, because they might all be happy to say, yes, let's build on that relationship. Sounds sensible. But as you say, it's about not second guessing what their views will be, because if you need to grow the group anyway, and so obviously you need to give them the space to kind of grow into the role and contribute. So but I don't think that'll be a problem at all.
I think the steering group at the early stage is going to be quite weighted towards South Lakes Housing. We've got a councillor joining who's on the board of South Lakes Housing. We've got one or two other councillors potentially, and with SLDC they're already linked with South Lakes Housing. It's kind of a done deal. So yeah, maybe we need more members who are onto councillors.
Maybe. Damien.
It was just a thought. So if a group of people set up a CLH, legal entity and all that sort of stuff then, and if there was opportunities with the private sector, so say the likes of Story Homes or some of these other Persimmons Homes who do developments in locations, And some of those developments have 106 agreements where there has to be an element of either social housing or affordable housing. So without exchanging any land or anything like that, could, in theory, that CLH model, could they then sort of purchase off the shelf, some of those units that on those schemes that are either earmarked with the local authority or whatever for affordable housing and social housing. So bypassing, I think traditionally housing associations have done that. They have sort of purchased them off them and then rented them out or did 50-50. Could, in theory, could you do that and miss all that sort of malarkey and deal with developers and have that so that you're doing it directly and less hassle, like the land that you buy, the developer has to do it anyway. And if you popped up and sold them a good idea and an agreement with the local authority that you're all legit, in theory, it could work.
No, it's a really good point. It's something which people have always said is possible, and I believe it has happened in one or two places, but it's not common. I think it would hinge on having lining up a relationship with a housing association in advance, because I think that's your route in. Because you know, in theory, if you were a well-organized group, I mean, some local authorities have said, right, we want community land trusts to be approved developers for quota sites that you're talking about. But in a lot of local authority areas, developers are allowed to invite housing associations to compete with each other. In one of the local authority areas I used to work in the south of England, they wouldn't allow that because they viewed that as being not efficient use of public funding, because it meant that not-for-profit organisations were having to try and find ways of offering more money. But it is the norm in most locations. So in fact, with Loon Valley, we actually did put together some bids for developers in the Halton area. And of course, you put a lot of work into the bid, and then there's no way you can tell if you're going to get a result from it. And if you're a big housing association, you can afford to do that from time to time. But if you're a small community organisation, it's a lot of your time, and it can be very disappointing. So I think the route in is to actually build a good relationship with the housing association. And what you're looking for is a housing association that's not just going to buy units off a developer, but it's going to actually be your champion and say, okay, we actually want to do some community-led housing. It's going to be a bit different. We want to talk to you about the specification, the layout. We want to have more input. And then you'd need also to have some kind of steer from the local authority on your behalf as well. I'm sure it would still be a little bit unpredictable, but you never know. I think these days, maybe developers are perhaps realizing that passive house is coming in, and apparently they're sending a lot of their staff off on training courses to understand how to do it. But I think it's the housing association that would be the key to unlock the door.
Unless you weren't looking to rent the houses, I guess, if you just wanted to buy them to have a shared ownership model or something, I can't quite see how it would work. But is there a way that a community could just step in, take the units on, as in buy them, and then
if the developer would take you seriously? But it still takes a lot of preparation, even just to even if there's no government grant involved, you've still got to do a lot of work, talking to the developer, trying to get them to design to your spec, and figuring out the tenure of the properties and how it would work and so on, and whether they're going to be self-policing through covenants, so you don't need a community land trust, or whether they would be actually owned by the community land trust, or if they would be just private homes if it was a private co-housing group. So all of those are possible.
I think of the things you mentioned, that the most likely route would be something like self-build or custom build as part of a larger development, as described by Damien. I think maybe developers are more comfortable with that somehow. I don't. Well, aside from the 106 stuff.
I think community-led housing is custom build. You know, because custom build is where a developer will build a house to more or less to somebody's specifications. So it's not where they make a piece of a building plot available and then somebody fiddles about doing self-build. They're building for the customer, so they've got it's good for them in terms of they get they've got customers lined up in advance, and that's what community-led housing groups do. They're basically looking for custom build. They want to actually have their designs delivered, and whether it's an individual house or it's a group of houses by a CLT or a co-housing group, I think it could all tick the box for the council as being a form of self-build, but it's custom build.
It's interesting that you describe it like that, because we've had a conversation with a developer who specialises in custom build, as he puts it, and he would find it difficult to relinquish control of plots on a site that he manages to another builder. And I think that's exactly what you're describing. If you wanted something built to your specification in a place where the builder is already specified, your options are by default going to be limited by the skills that are available to you from there.
I don't know about, I mean, self-build is a bit special, but it's not about where you've got like a custom build developer who's already going to develop a site, who then lets another builder onto the site. That's not what it's about. It's about having a discussion with a single developer and just delivering some of the houses to the specification of a community group rather than a bunch of individuals. So it's not about complicating that person's life by bringing in other builders. It's going to be one developer, you know, one builder, but designing different specifications for various different clients on their development.
The experience I had with one provider, and it was a big Story Homes, and the discount that the housing association got, these were 2 up, 2 downs, so they were selling them privately for 120,000. Housing association got them for 60,000 each, 60 grand each. So they were able then to do them at a cheaper rent, make them affordable. They didn't I must admit, like, the specification was terrible, and the quality of the materials were a bit dubious, once you got
to bleep a lot of that out.
Yeah, they do. The spec wasn't as good. But it just goes to show you then, like, the discounts that the housing associations were getting, and their model then for renting them out, and the allocation process. They had to maintain them and allocate them and deal with all antisocial behavior, anything that was going on. But it's another area, maybe as things increase, that could be a cheeky offer or an approach with the support of local authority and other organisations that might lend itself these days, given the land issue and the price of land.
I'm just noticing that Lucy's going to excuse herself. I don't know if you've got any last minute questions before you disappear, Lucy. Might have missed her. She's just put a message in the chat saying she's dashing off to another meeting, so apologies for interrupting you, Damien. I think we've lost her.
Just ask about the buying of a developer, because it's something that we briefly talked about. Is there an issue with, if it's part of the Section 106 policy requirement, that you're restricted with Homes England grants? I know Homes England won't grant aid on houses that must be provided to meet a policy requirement in a local plan. So is there any way around that, or are there issues there?
I think the Community Housing Fund, when it was in action, if you were going to be able to deliver extra affordable housing, then you could get capital grant for the extra houses. But of course, to me, that was very fanciful, because I can't think of any developers who would agree to having more affordable housing rather than less. You know, they're normally actually, as you know, they're actually kind of talking down the amount of affordable housing. So I don't think that you would ever get any capital grant into a 106 site, because I think it'd be very unusual if you got an extra percentage of affordable housing. So you're right, it's an issue, but that's housing associations, you know, put together bids because they're used to doing all this. They know how to pitch it roughly, whereas community groups are less experienced at that. So I think that's where it might be good to have a partnership.
So if you're confused that, would it be a case of you work with the RP to buy the affordable houses on a site that way, rather than do it directly with the developer? Because you've got to fund it somehow, haven't you?
Yeah, I think the RP would I mean, first of all, you need to actually clarify between the community group and the housing association exactly what they were going to propose. So it could be that it was going to be the housing association was going to do the development lease, or perhaps the consortium model for the community group, and then the housing association would lead negotiations with the developer to see if they could come to some sort of agreement.
I'm sorry, I just want to clarify that, because I was confused. Well, I still am confused, but what I thought Fiona was asking was if there is an obligation on a site to provide a percentage of affordable homes, and what you said, Andy, is you might then end up in a conversation about providing a bigger percentage of affordable homes. Fiona's question seemed to be, are those homes already paid for by Homes England and therefore can't be subsidised in any other way by Homes England? Is that it? Have I misunderstood that? I
think, Fiona, do you want to clarify, because you made the point?
I think Andy's answered my question.
Okay. All right, it's just me being confused. That's fine.
And what Fiona was talking about is that Homes England won't allow housing associations to use capital grant. They won't provide capital grant on Section 106 sites.
Yeah.
So you buy off the developer. The developer understands that. He's got to take that into account when they agree a price for the houses to sell to the housing associations. They know that the housing association isn't going to get capital grant. So it can, what it'll do is it'll put together a package, which is it'll be able to take out a loan which can be serviced by a certain level of affordable rent. That'll pay for the loan, and that loan might need to be topped up with who knows what internal resources that the housing association might be able to add to it. And then that will be what they offer to the developer. So the developer will see which housing association comes forward with the best offer. But it's an offer which is based mainly on loan and internal resources, and not capital grant.
Okay, that's helpful. Thank you very much. Thank you. Right, I'm looking at the clock and noticing that we have 20 minutes left. Obviously, we can keep picking Andy's brains and learning from each other's experience. That's brilliant. I'm just wondering if there is a conversation that we could usefully have about some of these incorporation models and rather like Lorraine's question about arms houses, the different sorts of governance structure that might be relevant in Kendal, or in some of the conversations that Damien and Lorraine are interested in elsewhere. Becky or Fiona, are you just following the trodden path towards a community benefit society? Is that what you're thinking at the moment?
It's what I was thinking, just because that seems to be the common choice. But I think Andy's meeting with our group on Friday evening, and I think he's touching on this then. So we probably will be having that conversation on Friday with the whole of our group. So
good, yeah,
just to make sure we do know which one we want to be. I think.
Yeah,
It's not something to rush into. The first thing to focus on is what you want to do practically, to actually think that through. What are we setting out to do, in terms of perpetuity and tenure mix and local allocations, and then if there's any add-ons like passive house and so on. So, think in a non-technical way about what you're setting out to do, and then you might want to consider things like a share issue, and that simplifies things a lot, because if you want to be able to do that kind of stuff, then there's only one way of doing it, and that's a community benefit society. But you would then run all that by a solicitor who would confirm what the best type of incorporation is to achieve what you want.
that makes perfect sense to me in the situation, and obviously if you're having that conversation on Friday, then we're jumping the gun slightly, but I just thought it was worth bringing it up while we're in the room, as it were. Lorraine, I saw you put a comment in about charitable purposes, in the sense of trying to clarify what Andy was saying early on about probably CICs and CIOs, and just making
Watch
sure
out for CIOs.
So it's just that quite a lot of groups I've worked with have very clearly charitable objects. And if you have charitable objects, then you have to register as a charity. So if you are dealing with poverty and affordability and all those kinds of issues, then you pretty much have to register as a charity. And therefore you can do the community benefit, because community benefits can register as a charity, but you can't do the CIC because CICs can't register as charities. But you can do the CIO, so the charitable incorporated company, as opposed to the community interest company. So there's a range of things out there. There's model documents for all of them. And even when you work with solicitors, they sometimes get it wrong. So it is worth having a range of conversations about this. Levens are having an interesting time of it at the moment, having had some legal advice, which has actually brought them to a place where they're not entirely sure they've got the right advice. So because things are very complex, is just the situation.
Seriously though, you do have to watch out for CIOs. Because
why?
Well, you might not actually be able to borrow any money if you're a CIO, because you don't have, with a conventional charity, you're registered as a company with Companies House. So they have a register of liabilities that anybody can go and check. Whereas with a CIO, you're just registered with the Charity Commission and there's no register of liabilities. So you're dependent on a lender, and they will vary, but some lenders won't be comfortable with that. And it's something which has been identified by the movement as an issue.
Okay, and the way around that is to use the model document that allows you to borrow, because most of the model documents for CIOs have permission to borrow within them, which you can take in or take out of your document.
It's not so much what's in the model document, it's the ability of a lender to go to Companies House, which you can't do with a CIO, to check on what outstanding liabilities the organisation has.
So this is something that has been experienced elsewhere, has been flagged as an issue in other communities, presumably.
I mean, I can provide there's a link I've got somewhere where somebody's pointed this out. So, but if you've got a lender who's prepared to make its own investigations, and I'm not quite sure how they would base the decision, but some lenders might be quite happy to actually go through the process and come to their own conclusions, and others might not.
It's interesting.
Okay, that's interesting. Yeah. Okay.
Gunnar asked me a little while ago, and I suppose it's a concern for me as well, but the financial risk to the trustees, the steering grid, the board, whatever we call them, is there a particular choice of model that is safer for that, or is that incorporated in all of them? Are we all fine in every circumstance?
I think the main message is if you don't break the law, you know,
try not to.
yeah, you'd have limited liability in most situations. Liability limited to £1, you know, that kind of thing.
Yeah. Well, I mean, in a very general sense, what I would say in an ACT capacity is that your protection from the law is only ever protection if you don't abuse it. You can't, you know, you're not protected against your own stupidity or wrongdoing, no matter what you are. So you still need to be clear on what the rules are around you. But you're right that there are ways in which you could be held personally liable, and you want to avoid those. You want to be in a situation where you're jointly liable, and where you're protected. But if within that somebody does something really stupid, you're not protected. You are still going to be held responsible in a court. So that's the long and the short.
That's where you know, the registered provider process is really not asking anything more of an organisation than they ought to really be carrying out anyway. You know, so organisations you know, do need to have you know, one or two people on the board who kind of are very familiar with the you know, the organisation's constitution and what they need to do, and you need to have really good policies and procedures, so that you're covering yourself. It's, you know, you need to have a robust approach to governance and review things. We've got a community land trust health check, for instance, which people can use on a regular basis, and just keep governance in mind most of the time, really.
Yeah.
And don't bother with trustee liability insurance, because it's not worth the paper it's written on.
Right.
Because if you're doing it right, you'll be covered. If you're not doing it right, you won't be covered, whether you've got insurance or not.
And I think also very often you need to have secondary rules, because the basic rules that go with the company don't cover a lot of the systems that you're going to have to need. You know, policies and procedures side of things, complaints policies, that sort of thing.
Yeah, I'm interested, Andy, in standing orders and stuff for CLTs and community benefit societies, because the model documents cover the big picture, but your actual daily operation is your standing orders and, as you say, your complaints policy and your lettings policy and all that, which isn't in your constitution, because your constitution is top line and everything under that. So the work comes, the constitution is really important, but the work comes with all the other policies that come along with the operation, really. Yeah,
and I mean, you know, we've got quite a library of you know, template policies, which makes it easy. You can get hold of those and adapt them for your own organisation and so on. But I think, yeah, there's been a lot of experience. Some of it has been a bit painful, where people haven't had very good policies, and then they found themselves in an unexpected situation. So it's kind of goes hand in hand. If you want to set up a company to do something, then it's a bigger job than probably a lot of people realise, really.
I had an interesting time with Levens talking about their lettings policy, because their lettings policy wanted to come in under standard rent, so under the normal lowest rent that you could do it at. They didn't want to be tied to that, and it took quite a lot of searching around to find policies that other people had used that had been checked through to actually find a way of expressing that, because they have money from South Lakeland District Council, which is government money for community-led homes, and therefore a lot of the policy stuff that South Lakeland wanted them to have was standard affordable rent, and they wanted to come in much below that, and writing that was quite challenging.
Well, that's interesting, because in theory, it might be easier to agree a lower rent with grant with a local authority, which is given grant, than it would be with Homes England, because the local authority has been given the community housing grant, but it's not subject to the same regulation as Homes England, so there's much more flexibility. And the complaint has been very often that in some communities, even because we've got one or two different rental tenures, so you've got the old social rental tenure, which used to be the lowest, and then you've got affordable rents. But all of these are also dependent on viability. So you've got to have a negotiation with the grant giver, because they don't want to give more grant than necessary. And as long as they're if they can see that the tenure is the one that's accepted within their organisation, like a social rent or an affordable rent, then that's tick the box for them. So they wouldn't necessarily want to support a rent that's lower than that, whereas communities very often need rents that are lower than those rents. So it's a local authority can to some extent set its own criteria, and a local authority in theory might be able to acknowledge that there's a logic to having a lower rent, because obviously
in general we didn't find South Lakeland District Council to be particularly flexible about that agreement.
Recently or a while ago?
Recently.
Right.
Yeah, recently. Right. Yeah. I think it was something to do with their capacity in their legal team and their willingness to accept risk, given they had very little capacity to go through the detail, which is understandable given the current circumstances and where local authorities have got to.
I used to manage Mary Hannah Cottages in Carlisle, which is a small arms house scheme of about 8-9 properties for ladies, and that was we were the managing agents. I worked for another housing association, and it was for Carlisle City Council who were the trustees of. They owned them and we managed them, and they were really, really good, where they wouldn't increase rents, actually reduce rents, and all the money and rents and anything else and service charge that was generated went onto that scheme. So the housing association couldn't rob it out and put it somewhere else. It was all, and they were quite, the city council were quite good. It was a small scheme, but very flexible and very empathetic to the needs of those tenants.
Of course, you also have to be careful that the organisation remains viable. So, rents obviously will affect that, and there are a number of cases where housing co-ops, for instance, have just let the rent stay at a certain level, so that they eventually become negligible, and the organisation hasn't been able to actually sustain itself. So it's a balancing act. But obviously, it's largely dependent on the grant givers and what their terms and conditions are.
It meant we couldn't put our management fee up because we couldn't put the rents up by. So it looked bad then if the housing association go, well, annual increase, we can't increase our management fee then because they're not even allowing us to increase the rent. It's good.
Fiona, go on. We can't hear you, sorry.
With the issues with South Lakeland and the level of rent, was that purely to do with the capacity and legal, as you say, rather than a principle? And has it been resolved?
I think if Levens were here, they would say that it wasn't purely that. But as somebody who was assisting them, that's what I saw, that it was about capacity and level of risk assessment in their legal department. Just because we were trying to do something different, something out of the ordinary that they hadn't done before. It's not sorted. It's not resolved as yet. They're still working through it. So you guys will be going through that journey, and you might have something to share with us, to share with Levens to help them move forward.
I mean,
So now in South Lakeland, the 80% market rent is still way out of the reach of many people on the affordable housing list. So if we've got a scheme that not only helps people with their utilities bills because it's maybe passive house, if we can also look to reduce the rents as well, it opens it up to a much wider range of people who are in need, rather than just the ones that are top that can perhaps meet those needs elsewhere if they really needed to.
Absolutely, yeah.
Because a local authority hasn't got the time or perhaps the inclination to think something through, take time out to actually. So what they do is they'll adopt a policy which is, let's say a copy of Homes England policy, rather than judging it independently, because they're just thinking, well, if we emulate that, then it's going to be some, we won't be criticised for it, so that'll be good for us. But so it depends on how much time people have got and whether or not they're somebody can persuade them to look at it again. But of course, there's no use charging less rent, as I said, if it means that the scheme isn't viable. So you do have to watch out for that.
Yeah.
I found it really interesting. Sorry, when I met Bill Bewley from the Keswick Community Housing Trust, and he was with one of my old teachers as well, and they were talking about how there'd been a disagreement within the group, which had never been resolved, but ultimately Bill and whoever got their way. But the shared ownership schemes, they didn't. The people in those homes didn't pay rent on top, and so for them, amazing. But for the people of the group that didn't agree with that, as far as they were concerned, the shared ownership people had a significant advantage to the renters, and they were potentially in a position where they could staircase to 100% because they were saving quite a lot each month. And then I don't know what the group then planned on doing. I think the group buys it back. But it was just interesting that situation occurred. Initially, they were trying to be as kind, altruistic as possible, but actually it really did upset the group. There was quite clearly real frustration between them about the decisions that were made.
I think some of this tends to shift a little bit as memories change over time, because my memory is a little bit different. I think the group had a sparky debate about whether or not to include anything other than rented houses at all. So the debate in my memory was, that half the group wanted it just to be purely rented housing, and half said, well, no, actually, there's lots of intermediate households who are, really struggling for a place to live in Keswick, and why can't we help them as well? And I don't think they saw any kind of competition between the two tenures, because they were just really meant for people on very different incomes. But I was quite inspired by their desire. Once they'd arrived at the decision that there was going to be a 50-50 split, I was really quite excited by their decision that they took a view quite rightly in my mind that shared ownership was a crazy tenure, because you've got to pay a mortgage and then you get whacked for a huge rent. Yeah. And on top of that, you've got to pay for the maintenance of the property. So you couldn't get a worse value deal than normal shared ownership. And we did the research and we proved that there was no legal requirement to charge a rent. And it was all down to discussions with Homes England, because obviously if you don't charge a rent, you need a bit more capital grant, you see. So a lot of things come back to the government of the day and the attitude towards subsidy.
Yeah.
Some people see subsidy as being it's a cost, and others see it as being an investment. So it's very kind of attitude driven, really. Because if you go back a few years, governments used to pay 100% of the cost of a house.
Yeah.
So yeah, and I think it was quite exciting, and also they also on this question of staircasing, they said, okay, another crazy thing to do with policy. If Keswick had been a village, staircasing wouldn't have been allowed. But because it was over 3,000 population, the residents had the right to staircase into higher levels of ownership. So the trust said, okay, we're going to write into our lease that anybody who starts to exercise their right to staircase, we will start to charge a rent. So it was a disincentive.
Yeah.
So they still have the right to staircase, but I don't think anybody has as yet. So, but these things, you've got quite a difficult policy environment to operate in, and you're always trying to kind of grapple with things and you're trying to implement a very simple idea in essence, but in a very complicated policy context.
Yeah. Listen, we've run over
Also
by 3 minutes.
Sorry,
I did say I wouldn't let us do that. So I'm going to draw us to a close. I'm sorry, Fiona, did you have something else you wanted to say?
I just thought we've potentially got a problem if we're looking for 100% affordable rent anyway, because the new consultation from the NPPF says there should be at least 10% as affordable home ownership. So
Right.
there's going to be that to have to bear in mind with any planning applications in the future if you're looking for 100%
The
rented
pressure to
scheme.
get people into the purchasing housing market is enormous. There's no doubt about it. That's the driver at the moment. Is this government wants everyone to own their own home or part of, and it does make it a whole other interesting policy context, really.
I think intermediate housing is massively undersupplied as well, and if you did it in the right way, it can be a really good thing.
Right. Thank you, Andy, for all your input and for a really useful presentation. It was very helpful, and I think has highlighted a lot of the things that people are thinking about. Thank you, Becky and Fiona, for coming along and joining in and hopefully taking some things away. I know I will be talking to people a lot more about thinking in terms of a prospectus and how they express their desires from a relationship. I think that's a really useful way for us to think about our conversations with groups. And I hope Lorraine and Damien have found something useful from this. So I'm gonna close the meeting now, and we'll call it a day. So cheery bye, folks. Thank you all very much.
See you all.
Nice to see you. Nice to meet you.